Dust choked the air as Almira Bancroft stepped off the stagecoach into a nightmare. 2,000 miles of travel for a promised cattle ranch had ended at a graveyard of smoking, blackened timber. Slumped against a lone, scorched stone chimney sat her new husband, Andrew Cade, bleeding, hollow-eyed, and gripping a loaded Colt revolver. He was a broken rancher who had just lost everything to a ruthless syndicate. Andrew stared at his mail-order bride, seeing only a delicate Easterner in ruined silk. He had no idea the desperate woman standing in his ashes carried a $250,000 fortune stitched secretly into her corset. The brutal August heat of 1,883 beat down on Owyhee County, baking the earth until it cracked. Almira Montgomery, or rather, Almira Bancroft, sole heiress to the Bancroft-Boston shipping empire, stood at the edge of the property line, her heavy wool traveling suit clinging to her damp skin. She had traveled 2,000 miles under an assumed name to marry a stranger, fleeing a ruthless uncle who intended to marry her off to a 60-year-old railroad tycoon to consolidate their wealth. Andrew Cade's advertisement in the matrimonial news had been her salvation. Seeking a strong-willed woman for a prosperous ranch in Idaho Territory. Must not fear hard work. A good home provided. Beside her, Reverend Thomas Miller shifted uncomfortably, wiping his brow with a checkered handkerchief. I tried to warn you in Silver City, Miss Montgomery. The telegram. It must have missed you in Omaha. I am so terribly sorry. Almira didn't answer immediately. Her striking green eyes swept over the devastation. The air still smelled heavily of charred pine and roasted earth. Tried D. The barn was a heap of blackened timber. The main house was nothing but a stone foundation and a solitary chimney. In the center of the ruin, beneath a makeshift canvas lean-to, sat the man who was legally bound to be her husband. Andrew Cade looked nothing like the tintype photograph he had mailed her. The man in the picture had been clean-shaven, clear-eyed, and proud. The man slumped against a charred wagon wheel had a week's worth of dark stubble, hollowed cheekbones, and eyes the color of a bruised winter sky. His left leg was stretched out stiffly, wrapped in dirty linen. Mr. Cade, the Reverend called out, his voice trembling slightly. Andrew didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head, his gaze dragging over the Reverend, before landing heavily on Almira. He took in her polished high-button boots, her pristine valise, and the expensive cut of her dress. A bitter, humorless laugh scraped from his throat. "You're late," Andrew said, his voice raspy from smoke and whiskey. "Though I suppose it doesn't matter much now. The wedding reception's been called off." Almira stepped forward, ignoring the Reverend's warning hand. The ash crunched beneath her boots, ruining the leather. But she didn't care. "I received no telegram, Mr. Cade. I have traveled for 3 weeks. We have a contract." Andrew braced his weight on a piece of scorched lumber and hoisted himself up. He winced, heavily favoring his right leg. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but physically diminished by a profound exhaustion. "Contract's void, Miss Montgomery. The ranch is gone. The cattle are gone. I have exactly $4 to my name and a bullet hole in my knee. The stage heads back to Boise tomorrow morning. Use your return ticket." "I do not have a return ticket," Almira said, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs and against the stiff, folded bank drafts of the Bancroft fortune hidden in the lining of her undergarments. "Then write to your family," Andrew snapped, his patience fraying. He limped closer, bringing with him the sharp tang of sweat, rye whiskey, and defeat. "Look around you, woman. This isn't a life. It's a graveyard. Josiah Hayes and his syndicate saw to that 3 nights ago. They burned me out, stole my herd, and shot me when I tried to stop them. You stay here. You'll either starve or catch a stray bullet. I have no family to write to." Almira lied, her chin tilting up defensively. "And I am not leaving." Andrew stared at her, the hostility in his blue eyes warring with a sudden, unbidden flash of respect. He sighed, rubbing a calloused hand over his face. "Reverend, take her back to town." "I am staying, Mr. Cade," Almira reiterated, dropping her heavy valise onto the ash-covered ground with a resounding thud. You advertised for a woman who does not fear hard work. Unless you intend to physically carry me back to Silver City with a bullet in your knee, I suggest we figure out where I am sleeping tonight." For a long moment, the only sound was the haunting whistle of the wind through the dead canyon. Andrew looked from Almira's stubborn, aristocratic jaw to the Reverend's helpless shrug. He finally turned his back, limping toward the lean-to. "Suit yourself," Andrew muttered over his shoulder. "But don't expect me to dig your grave when the winter comes." That night, Almira slept on the hard ground beneath a sky scattered with indifferent stars. The canvas tarp snapped in the wind. A few feet away, Andrew tossed and turned in a feverish, restless sleep, occasionally murmuring the names of horses lost in the blaze. Almira lay awake, feeling the stiff ridges of the $250,000 in bearer bonds and gold certificates pressing against her ribs. She could buy the entire town of Silver City 10 times over. She could hire a private army to wipe Josiah Hayes off the map. But if she revealed her wealth now, the Pinkerton detectives her Uncle Arthur had undoubtedly hired would hear of it before the first snowfall. Worse, looking at the broken, fiercely proud cowboy bleeding into the dirt, she knew the truth. If she handed Andrew Cade charity, it would strip away the last remaining shred of his dignity. To save him, and to save herself, they had to rebuild from the ashes together. Dawn broke over the Owyhees in a wash of pale, bruised purple. Almira woke to the ache of stones biting into her spine and the stark realization of her new reality. Her muscles protested as she sat up. Andrew was already awake, sitting on a stump, painstakingly cleaning the barrel of his Colt. 45. He didn't look up as she brushed the gray ash from her once immaculate skirt. "Coffee's in the tin," he said, his voice flat. "Water's in the creek. Fires. Well, fires everywhere. But you'll need to gather some fresh kindling for the pot." It was a test. Almira knew it. She didn't complain. She took the battered tin pot, walked a quarter-mile down to the creek, and returned with the water. She gathered dry sagebrush and splintered wood from the wreckage, ignoring the splinters tearing at her soft palms. By the time the bitter, muddy coffee was boiling, she had ruined her silk gloves and stained her cuffs irrevocably. Andrew accepted the tin cup she handed him, his eyes lingering on her blistered hands. "You're a long way from a parlor, Miss Montgomery." "I never cared much for parlors," she replied smoothly. They needed supplies. Andrew was too injured to ride, and his prized stallion had perished in the fire. He had a battered old mule named Jasper that had survived by wandering off into the hills, and a rickety buckboard wagon. "I'm going into Silver City," Almira announced, tying her hat securely beneath her chin. "We need flour, beans, nails, and lumber." Andrew let out a harsh bark of laughter. "With what money?" "I told you, I've got $4. That might buy us flour and some salt pork. But it won't buy nails, and it sure as hell won't buy lumber." "I have a little money of my own," Almira said carefully. Before leaving the lean-to, she had unstitched a seam in her petticoat and extracted a single, flawless emerald ring, a piece of her mother's jewelry she had kept separate from the bank drafts. "A small dowry, an heirloom I can sell." Andrew's jaw tightened. "I don't take a woman's money. I'm not a beggar." "You are not a beggar, Mr. Cade. You are my partner," Almira said, stepping into his space, forcing him to look at her. "We are in a contract. My investment is my survival. Now, hitch the mule." "I am going to town." The trip to Silver City was agonizingly slow. The mining town was loud, muddy, and teeming with rough men who stared openly at the beautiful, ash-stained woman driving a pathetic mule cart. Almira found the local jeweler and assayer. She drove a hard, cold bargain that would have made her ruthless uncle proud, exchanging the emerald for $300 in gold eagles and silver coins. She spent practically sacks of flour, coffee, a Winchester .73 rifle, ammunition, a heavy axe, a crosscut saw, shovels, and a wagon load of rough-cut pine boards. When she returned to the homestead, hours later, the sun was dipping low. Andrew stared at the loaded wagon in disbelief. He looked from the shiny new Winchester to Almira. How much was that heirloom worth? Enough, Almira said simply. For the next 2 weeks, the dynamic between them shifted from hostile strangers to reluctant allies. Almira traded her ruined silk dresses for denim work shirts and heavy canvas skirts bought from the mercantile. She learned to swing an axe, her hands developing thick, painful calluses. Andrew, driven by a stubborn refusal to let a woman outwork him, pushed through the agony in his knee. Together, they cleared the charred debris. They dug out the foundation. Andrew was a master carpenter. Beneath the layer of depression and grime, Almira saw the man he used to be. He moved with a quiet, rugged grace when working with wood, his hands measuring and cutting with precise intuition. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, nursing aching muscles, eating beans and cornbread. Almira had managed to avoid burning. The silence between them grew less tense, replaced by a comfortable, shared exhaustion. But the brutal reality of the West wasn't finished with them. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, the ground rumbled with the approach of horses. Almira stood up from the vegetable patch she was attempting to revive, wiping sweat from her brow. 5 men rode into the clearing. At their head was Emmett Walsh, the foreman for Josiah Hayes. He was a broad, cruel-looking man with a silver-studded holster. Andrew dropped his hammer, instinctively reaching for his hip, but his Colt was resting on a barrel 10 feet away. Walsh reined his horse in, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the freshly swept dirt near Almira's boots. He looked around the skeletal frame of the new cabin, a nasty grin spreading across his face. "Well, look at this, boys," Walsh sneered. "The cripple is building a birdhouse. Thought my boss gave you a clear message, Cade. This land belongs to the Hayes Syndicate now." "I hold the deed, Walsh," Andrew said, his voice deadly calm, though Almira could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "Now get off my property," Walsh laughed. "Deeds burn, Cade, just like houses, and this one looks mighty flammable." He spurred his horse a step closer, towering over Andrew. "Hayes wants you gone by Friday, or next time, we don't shoot you in the knee, we shoot you in the head." Walsh turned his leering gaze to Almira. "Shame to see a pretty little thing like you playing in the dirt. You ride back with us? I'll show you a real warm bed." The sharp, metallic clack-clack of a lever-action rifle chambering around echoed like a thunderclap through the canyon. Walsh froze. He looked down to see Almira standing 20 paces away, the new Winchester 73 pressed firmly into her shoulder. Her stance was perfect, her green eyes cold as glacial ice. She had the rifle aimed directly at Walsh's chest. "I suggest," Almira said, her Boston accent slipping out, clipped and aristocratic, "that you and your gentlemen remove yourselves from my property." Immediately, Walsh's hand hovered near his revolver. "You won't pull that trigger, little lady." Almira didn't blink. She shifted her aim down slightly and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. The bullet kicked up a spray of gravel violently, missing Walsh's horse's hooves by mere inches. The animal reared, screaming, nearly throwing the foreman into the dirt. "The next one goes through your knee," Almira said, jacking another round into the chamber with a swift, fluid motion. "I hear it's a popular injury around here." Pale and cursing, Walsh wrestled his horse under control. He glared at Andrew, then at Almira. "You're dead, both of you." He spurred his horse and galloped away, his men following in a cloud of dust. Andrew stared at Almira, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the smoking rifle, then up to the fierce, unyielding woman holding it. For the first time since she had arrived, a genuine, crooked smile touched the corners of Andrew Cade's mouth. "Miss Montgomery," he murmured, "remind me never to make you angry." September brought a bitter chill to the mountain air, turning the cottonwoods along the creek brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The frame of the new cabin was up. It was smaller than the original, a modest one-room structure with a sturdy roof and a stone fireplace. Andrew had painstakingly rebuilt, stone by heavy stone. The physical toll of the labor was evident on Almira. She was leaner, her face tanned by the sun, The soft curve of her aristocratic jaw now hardened into something fierce and beautiful. To Andrew, she was an enigma. He watched her haul water, split wood, and shoot a rattlesnake cleanly through the head at 30 paces. She possessed a refined grace that spoke of expensive finishing schools. Yet she worked with the desperate intensity of someone running from the devil himself. One evening, as the first frost crystallized on the window panes, they sat by the newly blazing hearth. Andrew was carving a wooden peg, his bad leg stretched toward the warmth. Almira was mending a tear in his canvas coat. "You never talk about your people back east," Andrew said quietly, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his scarred collarbone, visible where his Henley shirt was unbuttoned. Almira paused, her needle hovering over the heavy fabric. "There is little to say. My parents passed away when I was young. I was raised by an uncle. We did not see eye to eye on my future." "He wanted you to marry someone else?" Andrew guessed, his blue eyes perceptive. "He wanted me to marry a business merger," Almira corrected bitterly. "A man older than him, with a reputation for cruelty but a vast empire in railroads. I refused. My uncle informed me I had no choice, locked me in my room, and set a wedding date." Andrew stopped carving. The knife hung loosely in his hand. The anger that flashed across his face wasn't directed at her, but for her. "So you ran." "I climbed out a second-story window, took what savings I had, and bought a ticket west." Almira lied smoothly about the savings. "And then I found your letter." Andrew looked down at the wooden peg. "I'm sorry you traded one nightmare for another, Almira. I never meant to drag a woman into this war with Hayes." It was the first time he had used her first name. It sent a strange, warm flutter through her chest, entirely separate from the heat of the fire. "I am exactly where I chose to be, Andrew," she said softly. He looked up, meeting her gaze. The space between them felt suddenly small, charged with a heavy, unspoken tension. He reached out, his rough, scarred fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was hesitant, as if he expected her to pull away. She didn't. "Hayes burned my ranch because I wouldn't sell," Andrew whispered, his voice thick with a vulnerability he hadn't shown before. "There's a natural spring on the North Ridge. Only year-round water for 20 miles. He needs it for his massive herds. I told him to go to hell." That night, they came with torches. "I tried to get the horses out. I managed to save Jasper. But my stallion, Apollo, he didn't make it. When I ran out of the barn, Walsh put a bullet in my leg. I lay bleeding in the dirt, watching everything I built turn to ash." He dropped his hand, staring into the flames. "I swore I'd rebuild, but I was dying of infection and grief until you stepped off that stagecoach, Almira. You saved my life." Almira swallowed hard. Guilt clawed at her throat. She was sleeping on a fortune that could buy Hayes out, hire 100 men to protect the valley, and build Andrew a mansion. But she couldn't tell him. Not yet. His pride was too fragile, and his trust too newly won. Instead, she decided to drip her wealth into their lives. The next morning, while Andrew was patching the roof, Almira went to her heavy iron-banded trunk. She carefully extracted a stack of $50 gold certificates from her corset lining. She tore up a floorboard near the bed they hadn't yet nailed down, shoved a small pouch of coins into the dirt beneath it, and then called out in feigned surprise. "Andrew, come look at this." Andrew scrambled down the ladder, limping hastily into the cabin. "What is it?" "A snake?" "No," Almira said, kneeling by the loose board. She pulled up the dusty leather pouch. "I was sweeping. This was wedged against the foundation stones." "Did you bury this?" Andrew frowned, taking the pouch. He opened it, his eyes widening at the glimmer of gold. "No. The old homesteader who owned this plot before me. He was a prospector. Rumor said he hoarded his dust, but I never found a dime." "Good God, Almira. There's got to be $600 here. It seems our luck is turning." Almira smiled innocently. With the found money, Andrew's spirit soared. He rode into town and bought 20 head of prime Hereford cattle to start a new herd, wire for fencing, and winter provisions. For a brief, shining week, the ashes of the past seemed to finally blow away. But Almira's past was riding hard on a faster train. 2 days later, Almira was in the Silver City Mercantile, picking up an order of salt. The shopkeeper, a gossipy man named Henderson, leaned over the counter. "Say, Mrs. Cade, you're from back east, ain't you?" Almira stiffened. "Why do you ask?" "Fellow came through here yesterday, sharply dressed, bowler hat, flashing a tin star inside his coat. Said he was a Pinkerton detective hired by a fella in Boston, looking for a young woman. Said she had striking green eyes, dark hair, and went by the name of Bancroft." Henderson squinted at her. He offered a $500 reward for information. "Now, I told him I ain't seen no Bancroft, but I did mention Andrew Cade just took in a mail-order bride from the east with eyes just like he described." Almira's blood ran ice cold. Uncle Arthur had found her. "What did this Pinkerton man say to that?" Almira asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Said he'd be riding out to the Cade property first thing tomorrow morning to have a look for himself." Henderson chuckled. "I wouldn't worry none, Mrs. Cade. I'm sure it's just a coincidence." Almira grabbed the sack of salt, her knuckles white. It wasn't a coincidence. And if the Pinkerton found her, he wouldn't just take her back. He would legally seize all her assets, the fortune hidden in her trunk. And if Andrew got in the way, the Pinkerton would have the full backing of the law to shoot him dead. She had to get back to the ranch. Now, the ride back to the homestead was a blur of frantic, dust-choked terror. Almira drove the buckboard wagon so hard that the poor mule, Jasper, was lathered in white sweat by the time they crested the ridge. Her mind raced faster than the spinning wooden wheels. Uncle Arthur had not just sent any hired thug. He had contracted the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. If they had sent someone of repute, perhaps even one of their legendary operatives, her time was measured in hours, not days. Andrew was in the corral, hammering a newly planed rail into place. He dropped his mallet the moment he saw her tearing into the yard. He vaulted the low fence, his bad knee buckling slightly, but he caught the mule's harness to bring the wagon to a jerking halt. "Almira! What happened? Was it Walsh?" His hands went instinctively to the colt at his hip, his eyes scanning the ridgeline behind her for dust trails. "No," Almira gasped, practically falling from the wagon seat into his arms. For a fleeting second, the solid, calloused warmth of his chest felt like the only safe harbor in the world. But she pulled away, her breath coming in ragged heaves. "A man in town, a detective from Boston. He is looking for me, Andrew." Andrew's brow furrowed, the protective anger in his posture shifting into deep confusion. "A detective? From your uncle?" "He offered a $500 reward," she said, her voice trembling as she began hauling the heavy sacks of provisions from the wagon bed with frantic, uncoordinated strength. "Henderson told him about me. He is coming here tomorrow morning. Andrew, if he finds me, he has the legal authority to drag me back. I am technically a ward of my uncle's estate until I turn 25, or marry with his consent. Our marriage. It was, by proxy, a mail-order contract. They will contest it." Andrew took the heavy sack of salt from her shaking hands, setting it on the dirt. He reached out, gripping her shoulders firmly. "Breathe, Almira. You are on my land now. No soft-handed Boston detective is taking my wife anywhere. I don't care what papers he carries. My wife." The words struck her with a profound, aching weight. He was willing to stand between her and a loaded gun, and yet, she was still lying to him. The $250,000 sewn into the lining of her trunk inside the cabin felt like a ticking bomb. That night, under the cover of darkness, Almira made a desperate decision. While Andrew slept the exhausted sleep of a working man, she crept out of bed. She pried open the false bottom of her leather trunk and extracted the heavy, wax-sealed canvas parcels containing the Bancroft bearer bonds and gold certificates. She slipped out the back door of the cabin, a shovel in hand. Beneath the ancient, lightning-scarred oak tree 50 yards from the cabin. She dug. She buried her fortune deep in the Idaho earth, smoothing the dirt and covering it with dead leaves and stones. If the Pinkerton searched her belongings, he would find nothing but calico dresses and a few leftover silver coins. Morning came with the sound of approaching hooves. Andrew was already on the porch, his Winchester resting casually against his thigh. Almira stood behind him, the cool morning air biting through her shawl. A lone rider approached. He was not a soft-handed Bostonian. The man who dismounted was lean, weathered, and possessed eyes as sharp as cut glass. He wore a dusty bowler hat, but beneath his tailored coat, Almira spotted the unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster. "Morning," the man said, touching the brim of his hat. He didn't look at Andrew. His piercing gaze locked directly onto Almira. "I reckon you'd be Andrew Cade. And you must be Almira Bancroft." Andrew stepped forward, blocking the man's view of Almira. "Her name is Almira Cade. Who's asking?" The man reached into his breast pocket and produced a silver badge, the unblinking eye of the Pinkerton agency etched into the metal. "Name's Charlie Siringo. Pinkerton National Detective Agency. I've ridden a long way from Chicago on behalf of Arthur Bancroft of Boston, Massachusetts." Almira's stomach plummeted. Charlie Siringo was no run-of-the-mill investigator. He was a legendary manhunter, famous across the West for infiltrating outlaw gangs and tracking fugitives across unforgiving terrain. Uncle Arthur had spared absolutely no expense. "State your business and get off my property, Mr. Siringo," Andrew growled, his grip tightening on the rifle. "My business is with the young lady," Siringo said, his voice mild but carrying an undercurrent of absolute authority. "Miss Bancroft, your uncle is deeply concerned for your welfare. Furthermore, he is concerned about the $250,000 in bearer bonds and gold certificates that went missing from his personal safe the night you climbed out of a second-story window." The silence that followed was deafening. The wind seemed to stop blowing through the canyon. Andrew slowly turned his head to look at Almira. The betrayal in his bruised blue eyes was worse than if he had struck her. $250,000, he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Almira?" "Andrew, I can explain," Almira started, tears finally stinging her eyes. Siringo tipped his hat back. "The proxy marriage contract you signed with Mr. Cade is legally void, Miss Bancroft. Your uncle had a federal judge in Boston sign an injunction the week you left. You are coming with me back to Boise, and from there, a train to Boston. Mr. Cade, if you interfere, I will have you arrested for kidnapping and grand larceny." "I didn't steal it," Almira shouted, stepping out from behind Andrew, her fear evaporating into pure, unadulterated Bancroft fury. "It is my inheritance. My father left it to me in trust, and Arthur was draining it to fund his failing shipping lines. I took what was rightfully mine. That's for a judge in Massachusetts to decide," Siringo said calmly, pulling a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. "Get your things, miss." Andrew raised the Winchester, the barrel aimed squarely at Siringo's chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back echoed sharply. "Put the irons away, Pinkerton. She isn't going anywhere." Siringo didn't flinch. "You're a brave man, Cade, but you're a poor dirt rancher with a bad leg. I have 20 federal marshals waiting in Boise. You shoot me, you hang. You let her go. You live to rebuild your little shack." Before Andrew could answer, a high-pitched, terrifying whistle sliced through the morning air, followed by the deafening crack of a rifle shot from the eastern ridge. The bullet struck the porch post inches from Andrew's head, showering him in wood splinters. "Get down," Andrew roared, tackling Almira to the floorboards. Siringo instinctively drew his revolver, diving behind the water trough as 3 more shots rang out, kicking up dirt where he had just been standing. Josiah Hayes and his syndicate hadn't waited for Friday. They had come to finish the job. The valley erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked from the tree line, pouring lead into the newly built cabin. Windows shattered, showering the floor with glass. Andrew dragged Almira by her corset strings through the doorway, both of them scrambling over the rough-hewn floorboards as bullets thudded into the thick pine logs of the walls. Outside, Siringo was pinned behind the wooden water trough, returning fire with measured, deadly precision. Two of Hayes' men on horseback broke from the tree line, torches in hand, aiming for the new barn where the Hereford cattle were penned. "The cattle!" Andrew yelled, sheer desperation contorting his face. He grabbed his Winchester, ignoring the agonizing flare of pain in his ruined knee, and hauled himself up to the broken window. He fired twice, dropping the lead rider's horse. The rider tumbled into the dust, dropping his torch. Almira didn't hesitate. She crawled to the corner of the room, snatched up the Winchester 73 she had bought in Silver City, and jammed a handful of cartridges into her apron pocket. She threw herself against the wall beside Andrew, taking aim at the second rider. She fired, working the lever action with brutal efficiency. The second rider clutched his shoulder and wheeled his horse around, fleeing back into the trees. "There's at least a dozen of them," Siringo yelled from the yard, pausing to reload his revolver. "Cade, you got a back door?" "Barricaded," Andrew shouted back, firing blindly into the brush. "We're boxed in." For the next hour, it was a brutal, deafening stalemate. The smell of sulfur and burning wood filled the small cabin. Almira's ears rang continuously. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the muzzle flashes from the ridge. Beside her, Andrew was bleeding. A ricochet had caught him along the cheekbone, painting the side of his face in crimson. But he didn't stop firing. During a lull in the shooting, as Hayes' men repositioned, Andrew slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked at Almira, his expression a complicated mix of awe at her marksmanship and profound, devastating heartbreak. $250,000, Andrew said, his voice barely audible over the ringing in their ears. "You watched me break my back pulling stones out of the mud. You watched me count pennies for flour, and you had an empire stitched into your petticoats." Almira lowered her rifle, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Andrew, please understand. If I had told you, you would have sent me away. Or worse, you would have refused it out of pride. I needed you to need me. I needed a partner, not an employee. You bought me," Andrew corrected bitterly, wiping blood from his eye. "You bought a guard dog and a hideout." "I fell in love with you," Almira screamed, the words tearing from her throat before she could stop them. The absolute truth of it hung in the smoky air between them. "I fell in love with the man who built a house from ashes. I hid the money because I wanted this life, Andrew. I wanted you." Andrew stared at her, the anger in his eyes fractured, revealing the raw, wounded man beneath. Before he could speak, a heavy thud shook the cabin. "They're on the roof," Siringo bellowed from outside. The Pinkerton had managed to crawl from the trough to the side of the porch, using the woodpile for cover. A shower of sparks and burning pitch cascaded down the chimney into the hearth. Hayes' men were trying to smoke them out again. "I won't let them burn it down." "Not again," Andrew snarled. He pushed himself up, his bad leg giving out entirely. He collapsed with a grunt of agony. "Stay down," Almira ordered. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the bed, dunked it into the drinking water bucket, and threw it over the smoking embers in the hearth. Suddenly, the front door rattled violently. Someone was trying to kick it in. Almira spun around, raising her Winchester. The heavy oak door splintered, then burst inward. Emmett Walsh stood in the doorway, a cruel smile twisting his face beneath a soot-stained bandana, a double-barreled shotgun leveled right at Andrew's chest. "End of the line, dirt farmer," Walsh sneered. A gunshot deafened the room. It wasn't Almira's rifle. It wasn't Andrew's Colt. Walsh's eyes widened in shock. He looked down at the blossoming red hole in his chest, dropped the shotgun, and crumpled backward off the porch. Standing behind him in the yard, smoking revolver in hand, was Charlie Siringo. The Pinkerton stepped over Walsh's body and walked into the shattered cabin. He looked at Andrew on the floor, then at Almira trembling with her rifle. Outside, the sound of retreating hooves signaled that the rest of Hayes' syndicate, having seen their foreman killed by a federal man, were scattering to the wind. Siringo calmly ejected the spent casings from his revolver. "Well," the detective drawled, looking around the bullet-riddled room. "I reckon Mr. Bancroft didn't mention I'd be fighting a range war when I took this contract." He holstered his weapon and looked directly at Elmira. "Now, Miss Bancroft, about that $250,000. Where is it?" Elmira looked at Andrew, who was watching her intently. The fate of the ranch, her freedom, and their future hung on her next words. The acrid smoke of black powder hung heavy in the shattered cabin. Charlie Siringo stepped over the splintered remains of the front door, his boot heels echoing with absolute finality. He looked down at Andrew, who was clutching his bleeding face, and then at Elmira, whose knuckles were white around the stock of the Winchester. "I'll ask you one more time, Miss Bancroft," Siringo said, his voice stripped of all its previous mildness. "Where is the $250,000? Elmira lifted her chin. The terrified socialite from Boston was dead. In her place stood a woman forged by Idaho fire and desperation. "It is hidden, Mr. Siringo, and if you intend to drag me back to Arthur Bancroft, you will never see a single dime of it. I will die before I tell you where it is." Andrew grunted, pushing himself up against the bullet-scarred log wall. "You heard her, Pinkerton. You killed Walsh, and I'm much obliged for it. But you aren't laying a hand on my wife." Siringo stared at them both for a long, agonizing moment. Then, to Elmira's absolute shock, the legendary detective let out a low, dry chuckle. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a silver flask, and took a short pull. "You two are a piece of work," Siringo muttered, capping the flask. He leaned against the doorframe, looking out at the sprawling, burned valley. "I spent 6 weeks digging into Arthur Bancroft's ledgers before I took this job. Your uncle is a thief, Miss Bancroft. He's been defrauding his investors to keep his shipping lines afloat, and he intended to use your trust fund to plug the holes before the federal bank examiners caught on. He hired me because he couldn't go to the real authorities without exposing his own embezzlement." Elmira's eyes widened. "You knew? I'm a detective," Siringo said flatly. "It's my job to know. But I also know that if I ride back to Boston empty-handed, Arthur will just hire a dozen worse men who won't hesitate to shoot a crippled rancher and burn a woman out of her home." Siringo turned his sharp gaze back to Elmira. "So, here is the reality of the situation. Josiah Hayes just sent a small army to murder a Pinkerton operative. By tomorrow morning, I'm going to wire the federal marshals in Boise. Hayes is going to hang for this, and his syndicate is going to be dismantled. This valley is going to be peaceful." He stepped closer to Elmira, lowering his voice. "But Arthur Bancroft is still a problem. Unless Elmira Bancroft is dead." Andrew tensed. "What are you playing at, Siringo?" "I am a man who appreciates a hard-fought life, Cade," Siringo said. "And I don't much care for Eastern swindlers. Miss Bancroft, if you were to tragically perish in this terrible range war, along with the saddlebags containing your fortune when this cabin caught fire, well, Arthur Bancroft would have to face the music of his own bankruptcy, and I would have done my duty by reporting the tragic facts." Elmira's breath hitched. She saw the angle. "And what does the Pinkerton agency require to write such a tragic report, Mr. Siringo?" "Not the agency. Me," Siringo corrected, a sly smile touching his lips. "I reckon finding a body and fighting off a syndicate is hazardous work. A hazardous duty bonus of, say, $25,000 in gold certificates seems fair for an early retirement to a ranch of my own in Texas." It was extortion, pure and simple, but it was the cheapest salvation Elmira could ever buy. She looked at Andrew. The cowboy's blue eyes were unreadable, still shadowed by the betrayal of her lie. But he gave a single, slow nod. "Wait outside," Elmira told Siringo. "I will get your money." 10 minutes later, Elmira returned from the lightning-scarred oak tree, her apron heavy with dirt, and 5 wax-sealed bundles of gold certificates. She handed them over to Siringo. The detective counted them with practiced speed, tipped his bowler hat, and mounted his horse. "It's been a genuine pleasure, Mrs. Cade," Siringo said, emphasizing her new name. "If you ever come to Texas, look me up, but I highly suggest you stay dead in Boston." With a flick of the reins, Charlie Siringo rode out of the valley, taking Almira's past with him. The hoofbeats of Charlie Siringo's horse faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the Owyhee Canyon, taking Almira's past with them. Inside the shattered cabin, the air was thick with the bitter smell of cordite, roasted pine, and copper. The wind howled through the splintered remains of the front door, kicking up dust that settled over the small mountain of wealth piled carelessly on the rough-hewn dining table. $225,000 in Bancroft bearer bonds and gold certificates sat amid broken glass and spent brass casings. Almira stood motionless, her hands still shaking from the recoil of the Winchester. She slowly turned to face Andrew. He was slumped heavily against the base of the stone hearth, his long legs stretched out over the ruined floorboards. Blood from the ricochet wound on his cheekbone had tracked down his jaw, staining the collar of his canvas shirt a dark, rusted brown. But it was his eyes that terrified her. The bruising blue gaze that had looked at her with such fierce, protective warmth just hours ago was now vacant, guarded by a wall of insurmountable ice. "Andrew," Almira began, her voice a fragile whisper that barely cut through the wind. "Please, let me bind that wound." "Don't," he rasped, holding up a broad, calloused hand to stop her advance. He didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the small fortune resting on the table. "I spent the last 2 months breaking my back. I dragged river stones through the mud with a bullet in my leg. I counted pennies to buy salt pork, and I lay awake nights wondering how I was going to keep you from freezing to death when the snows came. And you had a railroad baron's ransom stitched into your skirts. I was running for my life," Almira pleaded, taking a hesitant step forward. The shattered glass crunched loudly beneath her leather boots. "If I had revealed that money the day I stepped off the stagecoach, what would you have done? Be honest with me, Andrew Cade. You would have refused it. Your pride would have demanded it. Or worse, you would have seen yourself as nothing more than a hired gun, a charity case for a runaway heiress. I did not want an employee, I wanted a husband. I needed an equal." Andrew let out a harsh, breathless laugh that ended in a wince of pain. "An equal? You bought me, Almira. You bought a guard dog to stand between you and a Boston Pinkerton, and you bought a plot of land far enough off the map to hide your stolen gold. You watched me bleed for this dirt while you were holding all the cards." "I bled for this dirt too," Almira shouted, the sudden ferocity in her voice startling them both. She marched across the room, ignoring his raised hand, and dropped to her knees directly in front of him. She grabbed his face, her thumbs pressing gently just below the bloody gash on his cheek. "Look at my hands, Andrew. Look at them." She thrust her palms outward. They were no longer the soft, manicured hands of a Boston socialite. They were rough as sandpaper, marred by thick calluses, deep rope burns, and a healing scar across her knuckles from an axe blade. "I did not buy my way out of the ashes," Almira fiercely declared, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her dirt-streaked face. "I dug my way out. Beside you. If I only wanted a bodyguard, I could have hired a dozen men in Denver. I stayed here because I fell in love with a broken cowboy who refused to stay down. I hid the money because I wanted to earn my place in your life, not purchase it. I wanted you to need me just as desperately as I needed you." Andrew stared at her. The rigid, angry set of his jaw slowly began to tremble. He saw the absolute, terrifying truth in her vivid green eyes. He looked at her blistered hands, remembering how she had stood shoulder to shoulder with him, working the lever of that Winchester to defend a cabin she could have easily abandoned. Before he could answer, a violent gust of wind tore through the canyon. The temperature, already dropping, plummeted sharply as the dark, bruised clouds of an early October squall crested the ridge. A freezing sheet of sleet blasted through the ruined doorway, immediately chilling the room. "The storm is breaking," Andrew muttered, his survival instincts finally overriding his wounded pride. He tried to push himself up, but his bad knee, twisted brutally during the gunfight, simply gave out. He collapsed backward with a sharp grunt of agony, his skin turning dangerously pale. "Almira." "The door. We have to board the door." The argument was over. Survival demanded it. Almira scrambled to her feet. She grabbed the heavy wooden dining table carelessly, sweeping the hundreds of thousands of dollars onto the dusty floor, and dragged it across the room. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she hoisted the table against the shattered doorframe, barricading the freezing wind. For the next 2 hours, as the Idaho blizzard raged outside, Almira worked with frantic precision. She ignited a roaring fire in the hearth using splintered floorboards. She boiled water, tore her last clean petticoat into bandages, and knelt beside Andrew. He was shivering violently, the shock of the gunfight and the blood loss finally taking their toll. She cleaned the jagged wound on his cheek, stitched it with a sewing needle and heavy thread while he bit down on a piece of leather, and bound his swollen knee tightly. Through the long, freezing night, she held him. She wrapped them both in every heavy wool blanket they owned, pulling his head onto her chest, sharing her body heat as the wind threatened to tear the roof from the cabin. In the quiet dark, surrounded by scattered gold certificates, Andrew finally wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her neck. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the dark, his voice thick with exhaustion and surrender. "I'm a stubborn fool, Almira." "You are," she whispered back, kissing the crown of his dark hair. "But you are my fool." When the storm broke 3 days later, leaving the Owyhee Valley blanketed in pristine, glittering white snow, they began the arduous task of turning a stolen Boston fortune into a legitimate Western empire. They could not simply walk into the Silver City Bank with $200,000 in bearer bonds. Questions would be asked. Telegraphs would be sent. Instead, as soon as the mountain passes cleared, Andrew and Almira left the ranch in the care of a trusted neighbor and boarded a stagecoach for Winnemucca, Nevada. From there, they took the Central Pacific Railroad west, straight to the bustling, fog-drenched streets of San Francisco. Dressed in newly tailored, conservative clothes, Almira and Andrew walked into the opulent, marble-floored offices of Wells Fargo and Company. They bypassed the standard tellers and requested a private meeting with Lloyd Tevis, the shrewd, formidable president of the bank and one of the most powerful financiers in the West. In a mahogany-paneled boardroom overlooking Montgomery Street, Almira laid the remaining canvas bundles on the table. She did not lie to Tevis. She told him precisely where the money came from, who her uncle was, and the leverage she held over his fraudulent shipping ledgers. She presented Charlie Siringo's official report of her tragic demise in an Idaho range war. Tevis, a man who had built his own empire on the ruthless, chaotic edges of the gold rush, was deeply amused and profoundly impressed by the young woman and her stoic, scarred husband. Arthur Bancroft is a known quantity in the East, and a rather fragile one at that, Tevis noted, tapping a silver pen against his desk. If he believes you are dead, he will scramble to cover his debts, likely liquidating his assets. He will never come looking for this capital. You require discretion and a corporate shield. Tevis helped them establish the Owyhee Land and Cattle Trust, an impenetrable corporate entity registered in California, but operating in the Idaho territory. The Bancroft bearer bonds were quietly absorbed into the bank's deep vaults, and in exchange, Andrew and Almira were issued an unlimited line of clean, untraceable credit. They returned to Silver City, not as runaway fugitives, but as titans. With Josiah Hayes hanging in a federal penitentiary and his syndicate shattered, his vast land holdings fell into foreclosure. The Owyhee Land and Cattle Trust bought every single acre at auction. By the spring of 1884, Andrew Cade held the deed to over 100,000 acres of prime grazing land, stretching from the Snake River Plain to the jagged peaks of the mountains. They tore down the bullet-riddled cabin and built a sprawling, magnificent ranch house of heavy cedar and river stone. It boasted wraparound porches, a massive stone hearth that could hold a 6-foot log, and, most importantly, a solid oak front door that would never be kicked in again. On a bright, cloudless Tuesday in May, Almira and Andrew stood before Reverend Thomas Miller in the small, newly painted church in Silver City. The entire town, from the prospectors to the mercantile owner, crowded into the pews to witness the union. Andrew wore a custom-tailored broadcloth suit, though he still carried his Colt, 45 at his hip, and he leaned slightly on a silver-tipped walking cane. Almira wore a stunning gown of ivory silk imported from Paris, but beneath it, hidden from the world, she wore the heavy leather boots she had bought her first week in the dirt. "Do you, Andrew Cade, take this woman?" Reverend Miller asked, smiling warmly at the couple who had single-handedly dragged the valley out of a bloody range war. Andrew looked down at Almira. He saw the fire in her green eyes, the brilliant, ruthless mind that had saved him, and the tender heart that had healed him. He reached out, taking her calloused hands in his own. "With everything I have," Andrew vowed, his voice steady and echoing through the quiet church. "Until the ashes take us both." Almira smiled, a brilliant, unrestrained expression of pure joy. She had traveled 2,000 miles to escape a cage, only to build an empire out of fire, dust, and the unshakable love of a broken cowboy. The Cade Ranch stood for nearly a century as a testament to the brutal, beautiful promise of the American West. Almira and Andrew Cade built a dynasty that outlasted the gold rushes and the railroad barons. Their children and grandchildren grew up on stories of a Boston heiress who traded silk for sawdust, and a broken cowboy who found his salvation in the smoking ruins of his darkest day. While historians would later marvel at the sudden, unexplained influx of capital that birthed the vast Cade Empire, the true wealth of the family was never the hidden bearer bonds. It was the unshakable bond forged in the crucible of Owyhee County, a love story written in blood, ash, and the stubborn will to survive against all odds.